All right, so I'd like to switch gears now and talk a little about the chemtrails conspiracy. Now, there's a lot of overlap between the two communities, I think. A lot of truthers believe in chemtrails. A lot of chemtrail people believe in truthism. Interestingly enough, when I was a truther, I always thought chemtrails were bullshit, and I was always quick to argue with people and point out, no, it's just contrails. And to me, it was quite easy to see through the conspiracy theory. But what's your general assessment about the chemtrails conspiracy?
Well, it's kind of similar in a way to the 9/11 in that people just make a mistake in evaluating some evidence, and then they get stuck in that belief. And it's often based on very, very simple things, like people with 9/11 think like the buildings fell too fast. With chemtrails, it's generally based around the belief that normal contrails should not persist in the sky. And a contrail is a cloud that forms behind an airplane sometimes because of the moisture in the engine exhaust. Like all engines that burn fuel create water, so they have hot, humid exhaust, and like your breath on a cold day, that will condense. And if it's very, very cold, that condensation will freeze and form an ice cloud, which can persist. Now, they have become convinced that these contrails should evaporate quickly. And often the reasoning that they give for that is that when you breathe out on a cold day, your breath will evaporate, essentially evaporate. It would dissipate. It'll disappear very quickly. That's something they might not have noticed is that the colder it gets, the longer your breath actually stays there. If it's below 0 Fahrenheit, then your breath can actually stay in a cloud form for quite a long time. And where contrails form is actually minus 40 degrees, minus 40 Fahrenheit, which is actually also minus 40 Celsius, which is an interesting and confusing point for some people. So minus 40 degrees, very, very cold. When you breathe out at minus 40 degrees, your breath actually forms a cloud which doesn't evaporate. And you can actually see this. There's some videos of people actually who live in places where it gets to minus 40, and you see them standing around talking, and you see all these clouds around them. And that's what a contrail is. It's just condensation. And it forms a cloud, just like a regular ice cloud in the sky, and clouds sometimes persist and sometimes they don't. But the chemtrail people have got this mythology, just like 9/11 people have a mythology. And part of that mythology is that contrails should vanish quickly, and that when they were young, contrails always vanished quickly. And now we have this new type of plane, the high bypass jet engine, which doesn't make contrails because it's a different thing. You know, all these things are just a mythology which is wrong, and a mythology which has been answered and has lots of very detailed answers in various places. And if you are intellectually honest, then you can weigh one side against the other, and you can see that, yes, contrails do persist. Yes, modern planes do actually make contrails. And yes, they did used to make contrails when you were young, even though you don't remember it, because here's all this photo and video evidence. So it's a conspiracy theory based upon a mythology.
I often like to point out that the distinction they think exists between contrails, they dissipate quickly, you see it behind the plane, and then it vanishes. That compared against chemtrails, which they say they linger, they spread around, that distinction is a completely manufactured one that only exists in their imagination. The way I like to put it is to say it would only make sense to expect contrail uniformity on a planet that has atmospheric uniformity. Like you look out in the sky. You know, today it's partly cloudy. Tomorrow, maybe it's going to be completely clear blue sky. The next day, it might be raining. Maybe there's going to be some sheet clouds. Maybe it's going to be foggy the day after that. The point is, we live on a planet where there's a lot of variation in the atmosphere and the weather that's around us. So it would only make sense to see variation in contrails that form, especially if contrails are just a form of man-made cloud, basically. So it's, like I said, it's a distinction that just exists in their imagination. And it's a point that I don't often hear them respond to.
Yeah, partly because it's perhaps a little bit more complicated than they're used to thinking about with this issue. Like it's a fairly simple thing to say that there's a normal contrail that dissipates, and then there's these weird long contrails that we're going to call chemtrails, which don't dissipate. And then there's contrails that break up into pieces. And then there's like different types of contrails. There's ones that sometimes you get these little wiggly lines in them, and then there's ones that form in kind of sheets rather than in straight lines. And there's ones that have these little pendules underneath them. There's all these different types of contrails. But these are all things that we know about. And if you look at any book on clouds, it usually has a section on contrails, and it describes what these things actually are. So they're usually not basing their statements about what's normal and what's abnormal on anything other than what they've seen on the internet in some chemtrail video. And then they compound that with their own personal memory. This is kind of like the big reason why people kind of get sucked into this, is that they think that they don't remember contrails persisting, when really they don't remember anything about what the sky looked like 10 years ago.
Right, like that'd be such a weirdly specific memory to hold. It's like I remembered exactly what clouds looked like when I was 9 years old. It's just weird.
Yeah, they often cite that they used to lay in a field staring at the sky. They probably remember one summer, that they had this lovely day when they went out and lay in a field and looked at the sky. And it was a lovely blue sky day with little puffy clouds, and there was no contrails in the sky, or maybe the planes were leaving the short contrails, because that's what the weather was that day. They didn't lay in the field every day and look at the sky and compare it to the day before and like remember every single day. They had this one memory that they somehow extrapolated into their entire childhood. I remember very little of what I did when I was 8 years old. That was a long time ago now. But your memory of your childhood things tends to center around specific events rather than a memory of what happened from day to day. So you'll remember one particular nice day. So, but it's kind of an irrelevant point, really, because there's so much video evidence and so much photographic evidence. And also you could point to like different people start remembering contrails persisting at different times, even though they live in the same place. Like I did a survey of people, like say, when did you first notice these persistent contrails? And it was usually just after they'd heard about the chemtrail conspiracy theory, and they looked up and they were like, oh, look, I don't remember that last year. And whichever year it was, that's when they started remembering it. And there's a famous chemtrail conspiracy guy called J. Marvin Herndon, who was actually a nuclear scientist, some degree, but now he's kind of gone off on his own. He has his own weird theory of the universe and the Earth. And he's a chemtrail believer. And he writes that he never saw persistent contrails ever over where he lived up to about 2 years ago. Maybe like 3 years ago now. It's come around to this day. But like 2 years ago. So before, I think it was like 2016, say. He never saw any persistent contrails over where he lived. But where he lived was San Diego. And San Diego had a local chapter of San Diego Skywatch, like almost 10 years before that date. So there's people in San Diego pointing up at these contrails going overhead and saying, look at all these chemtrails, what's going on? But J. Marvin Herndon, this scientist that they cite all the time, has been just going along his merry way, never noticed the sky. Finally, he reads about the chemtrail conspiracy theory, and he's like, what? That doesn't make any sense. And he's, oh my God, contrails are persisting. I never noticed that before, when it's been going on all along under his nose. So if he can get it wrong, he's a scientist. You can get it wrong. What's to say that you couldn't get it wrong? And there's all this evidence that you got it wrong. There's all these photos and these videos from going back to the 1940s. And the earliest photo I have of a contrail, I think, is 1937, in a book that was published in the 1940s. So, contrails have been around as long as planes have been able to fly high enough.
Well, obviously that picture was planted there by the Illuminati. No, I'm kidding. One thing that you'll often hear people who believe in chemtrails point to is they'll say, oh, look at all these photographs of the interior of chemtrail planes, and that's proof of it. And sometimes they'll even show you photoshopped images where it's like a tanker inside of a plane, so clearly some sort of fluid inside of it, and it says like danger or chemtrails on side of it. But then you just run a simple reverse image search on Google, and you find the original image where it's like that's not on there. And then you read the description.
Yeah.
It's like these are ballast tanks used in airplane testing, where it's filled with water, and the water shifts around to test the stability of the plane during flight and so forth. And so they're taking pictures that if you just glance at them, especially if it's presented like in a chemtrail video where it's like leaked inside of chemtrail planes or whatever, it might look convincing to you. But then you just do a little research, and the explanation makes total sense.
Yeah, there are things that people are not aware of, like this thing with the ballast barrels. You see these planes full of ballast barrels that they use when they're testing planes, when they first build them. And most people have never heard of this before, and they've never seen photos of this thing before, because it's just this kind of obscure thing that most people, if they did happen to see it on TV, they wouldn't even remember it. But then someone who believes in the chemtrail conspiracy theory sees it, and they think that, oh, this is proof. Here's something I've never seen before. This is proof. And this goes on in other areas too, like weather modification is often cited as being something that chemtrails are doing, like they're trying to modify the weather with these chemtrails. And so they eventually will come across something like Weather Modification Inc., which is an actual website. You can go to it, and it's a company that does weather modification and has been doing weather modification since, I think, the 1960s. So they discover that people are actually doing weather modification, and they'll find an article like explaining what weather modification is, and they say, oh, look, it's proof. This is proof of chemtrails. And it's not. It's just proof of weather modification. If you see a plane spraying something, they say, oh, look, proof of chemtrails. No, it's a proof of a plane spraying something. Like, you get planes spraying for mosquitoes, or you get crop dusters, or you get weather modification. You get planes flying over clouds, spraying stuff into the clouds. This is just, these are things that exist, which seem like proof when you first come across them, because you'd never seen them before. But they weren't things that were hidden. Weather modification was something that was done so openly that they would actually put adverts in the small ads of the local press saying there will be weather modification next Tuesday over the valley behind the hill. So you'll see a small plane spraying stuff in the air. This was openly done for decades and still is being done. So people think things are evidence when they're actually not evidence, because they're just new to them, and then they stop at that point. They don't go further and figure out what they actually were. So if you look into these things like ballast barrels, there are explanations, very simple, straightforward, and obvious when you think about it. Ballast barrels have been used since the 1950s, like the first, the 707, Boeing 707, can't remember when that was exactly. They used ballast barrels in that to test it, and there's photographs of it, and it looks pretty much the same as the ballast barrels of today. So yeah, there are explanations for things. So don't stop as soon as you find something. Check to see if there's actual explanation as well.
There's a famous documentary that chemtrailers love to direct you to. It's called What in the World Are They Spraying? And inside of that documentary, one of the things they point to are these sort of geoengineering ideas. And what I find especially amusing about this documentary and a lot of the articles is oftentimes what they're pointing to are just proposals for things that we could conceivably do in the future. It's like they'll point us to a scientific conference where they're discussing maybe to combat climate change, we could spray these things into the sky that'll reflect more incoming solar radiation. And I look at that and I say, simply proposing something that we could do in the future is not proof positive that there's a global campaign going on for sinister ends like you talk about. And then you also look at, like, what are they actually doing here? It's like their stated motive is we're spraying the stuff to help combat global warming. That's not at all the same as these people saying it's to dumb us down, it's to make us sick and give us the chemtrail flu or whatever it may be. And so the motive isn't the same as well. And then the final thing I find amusing about that is, on the one hand, they tell us it's a secret plot behind closed doors, Black Ops, whatever. They say it's a secret thing that's going on, and as proof of that, they direct us to publicly discussed proposals. And I'm like, it seems like there's a bit of a contradiction there.
Yeah. Another thing they point to is patents. They will say, look, here's a patent for geoengineering, and that proves that it's being done, which, of course, it doesn't. I mean, first of all, if it was this super secret thing, why would they be patenting it and explaining it to everybody? But just because something is patented doesn't mean it's actually real and being used. It doesn't even mean it actually has to work. mean, there are patents for houses on the moon, like lunar habitats. There are patents for spaceships that go to Mars. There are patents for like farming on Mars. Just because there's a patent for farming on Mars doesn't mean that, for one, that patent will actually work, and it doesn't mean that there are farms on Mars, because we know that there are not farms on Mars. And it's the same thing with the geoengineering thing. Just because there's a patent for a certain type of geoengineering, it doesn't mean that that patent is going to work. It doesn't mean it's actually a viable technology. And it doesn't, of course, mean it's being used. It might indicate a perceived intent or a perceived need for something. Like, we think that there's going to be geoengineering in the future, so let's patent this just in case we do. That's why people patent houses on the moon, because they think there's going to be houses on the moon at some point, and so they figure they'll get in early and patent the idea and make some money in the long run. But yeah, patents don't mean anything. Proposals, they mean that people want to do it in the future, or think that they might want to do it in the future. Most of the geoengineers that I've talked to, and I've actually talked to quite a few of them, don't want to do geoengineering. They think it'd be a bad idea. They all want to do carbon reduction. They want to cut carbon emissions drastically, because they think that's the best way of actually addressing the problem, rather than, it's actually addressing the cause of the problem rather than addressing the symptoms. But They think that we should have geoengineering as kind of a backup plan. But none of them think it's a viable thing to do in the immediate future. It's certainly not something that's been done for the last 30 years, which is what the chemtrail people say. We don't even know how to do it now. We don't even know the actual side effects and what would work and what's the best way of spraying the stuff and that. So the idea that we've been doing it for 30 plus years is just makes no sense whatsoever based on these studies that they actually point to as evidence. So their evidence works completely against them.
Another major piece of evidence I'll point to are what they claim are samples of so-called chemtrails. And I came across one particular article that I just found absolutely hilarious, because it was transparently like they just made up what they found in a so-called chemtrail sample. But it was some weird conspiracy website where it's like everything is typed in all caps, like one of those wacky websites.
I think I know what you're talking about.
They were saying, they were saying stuff like, oh, we detected 17 viruses and 20 molds in 2 cancers. Yeah. And that right there is the dead giveaway, because it's like cancer isn't just this free floating thing that'll waft in on the air and you inhale it and it's like, oh no, I have cancer. Cancer is simply a description of cell replication gone haywire. So to be like, we detected 2 cancers in a chemtrail sample is obvious proof that you don't know what you're talking about and you just made it up completely. And there's another in the documentary, What in the World Are They Spraying? They have a sample of what they claim is from after heavy chemtrail spraying, and I'm wondering how you respond to that one.
Well, the big one that they present in that documentary is a sample they took from a pool on the property of one of the guys, Dane Wigington. He has this nice property on top of a hill, and he has a water pool up there that he describes as being like a pristine pool with nothing flowing into it, just rain. And he takes a sample of it and analyzes it, and it shows a very high level of aluminum. And he says, this is impossible. So they must have been spraying. This must be the result of spraying. But if you look at what he actually tested, it actually lists it on the test report as being sludge. And if you look at the actual procedure that's on his website for how to test water, they say take your test tube and dip it down to the bottom of the pool where the dirt is, and make sure you get a little bit of that dirt in the test tube with the water. So what they're actually testing isn't actually the water coming out of the sky, it's the dirt in the pool. And if, in California, it's very, very dusty in the summer. So you get a lot of dust in the air, and that dust ends up in a pool. Yeah, any surface that you leave outside is just going to get dust. Dust in the country, out on the hills, is made up of dirt, made up of soil, which is made up of minerals. And the minerals in California are 10% aluminum, because it's stuff like aluminum oxide and aluminosilicates. It's you would expect to find these levels of aluminum. So he kind of misrepresents what he's actually testing. He's not testing the water. He is testing the sludge at the bottom of its pool. Now, sometimes they do test rainwater, but rainwater itself is expected to have dust in it because there's dust in the air. So especially the first rains that come down are going to have dust in them. And people will often, you leave out your rain collection device and it gets a bit dusty because it hasn't rained for a few days. And then when it does rain, the rain mixes with that dust, which contains lots of aluminum, and so you get these test results. So basically all the test results that they put are within the ranges of what you would expect to find. And when they say that they are ridiculously high, they're either misrepresenting the test, or sometimes they're using the wrong units. Like sometimes they use parts per million instead of parts per billion. And so this is 1,000 times what it should be. Oh, yes, it's 1,000 times because you're using the 1,000 times the units. So that's why that's wrong. So there's a whole bunch of tests, and you can go through each one individually, and you can explain why this particular test has this particular number and what the possible reasons are. But they like to present it as this body of evidence. There's another one. There's a famous test they use. Mount Shasta snow had these very high levels of aluminum, and luckily again they put up the test results sheet, and it says taken from the ski bowl of Mount Shasta on July the 6th. So it was snow sampled on July the 6th in California, which means it hasn't actually snowed for at least 2 or 3 months. And it's being quite hot and sunny, which means the snow is mostly dissipated, and the snow is covered with dirt. I actually tracked down photographs from people who went hiking the day before on Mount Shasta in that exact spot, and they have pictures, and you can see the snow just laying around in various spots, and it's got this kind of orangey brown dirt all over it. So again, they were just testing dirty snow, which means that the test results were coming from dirt. They weren't actually coming from the air or anything like that. So you get these very bad tests. You get people not understanding what they're testing, not understanding that aluminum should be there, and these other things that they test for, like strontium, barium, and aluminum. All these things are things that are in the Earth's crust, and they exist in the Earth's crust in the same ratio as they are found in these tests. So you find loads of aluminum, you find a little bit of barium, and you find a bit less of strontium. Look at the composition of the Earth's crust page on Wikipedia, you will see that exact same thing. The Earth's crust has loads of aluminum, it has like a little bit of barium, and it has a little bit less of strontium. It also has all these other things like iron, magnesium, and all kinds of other things. And if they tested for those, they would find those too. But they're only testing for these 3 things. So they just find these 3 things, and they find them in the expected ratio. So they're not finding anything suspicious at all. They're finding exactly what you'd expect on Earth.
I also think it's very funny how non-rigorous and non-scientific some of these tests are. Like some dude just goes out to his backyard pond and he's like, yeah, I'm just going to collect a sample of like some pond water. And even if it was just like a pristine water sample with no sludge contamination, you look at that and it's like, who knows what the source of these devious chemicals that you're pointing to could even be. Maybe there's a factory nearby where there's, like some emissions that are settling in your ponds. Maybe you just do a terrible job taking care of your pond and chemicals are building up or whatever. To point at that and be like, it's proof that 30,000 feet up in the sky they're spraying stuff, I think is quite the mental leap. And it's, to point at that, like a rainwater sample, like you were also talking about, to point to that and say, therefore, it's proof that up in the sky they're spraying stuff. Again, it's a mental leap that's not justified. What I want to know is where are the samples where they actually like somehow get a balloon up into a passing, like a chemtrail, what they call a chemtrail, just got sprayed, and they send a balloon up there and actually take a sample of that. I don't see anything like that. All they're pointing to is stuff like, oh yeah, I got some water from my pond, and that's proof of conspiracy.
Yeah, and the times when people actually have sampled chemtrails, or contrails, which they describe as chemtrails, people actually do this. They actually go and they fly behind planes and they sample the contrails because they want to study the ice crystal formations and things like that, and they want to check to see the particulates in the contrails. So when a contrail forms, it's partly forming around the engine exhaust particulates. the often just bits of carbon, bits of soot, but also other things as well. There's sulfur compounds and things like that. And you will find other things in engine exhaust, just simply because you've got trace levels of pretty much everything in jet fuel. You're going to have 1 part per billion of aluminum or something like that in your jet fuel, just because you can't have everything of a purity of 0 parts per billion. So people have actually gone and they've tested the exhaust to see the composition of things like the nuclei of the ice crystals, the little bits of dust or whatever that's in there, and they find bits of the engine exhaust, and so they'll find minuscule, microscopic amounts of various things like bits of metal in there, and the chemtrail people latch onto this and they say, "Oh, look, it found metal in the chemtrail," when really it's this. It's not even a part per trillion at that point. It's almost nothing. It's a small part of some nuclei of some tiny ice crystals, has a few molecules of whatever, strontium or something like that. It's pretty much meaningless in terms of the actual composition of the contrail. The contrail itself is still ice crystals, and contrails are not even mostly the ice that comes out of the back of the plane. The water that comes out of the back of the plane is what causes a contrail to start forming. But it actually accounts for much less than 1%. In fact, sometimes as little as 1,000th of the proportion of the ice in a contrail is the original water that came out of the back of the plane. All it's doing is it's triggering the formation of a cloud, and then it kind of the air. The water in the air around forms the contrail. So when people go up and they say they tested a contrail and they found metals there, they really haven't found anything other than what you would expect to be in the air. If you just sampled the air anywhere, you're going to find bits of dust. You're going to find bits of things which contain metal, because various minerals contain metal. There's pollution from factories in the air, so it's just stuff that you would expect to find. And you find slightly more of certain things in aircraft exhaust, because aircraft exhaust has the products of jet fuel combustion in, so you're going to find a little bit more of that. But you're finding exactly what you would expect behind a jet plane flying through the air over wherever in the middle of America or Europe or whatever like that. So you're not finding anything unexpected. And people taking a little bit of this and saying, "Oh, look, there's a metal in this long test result at 0 points per trillion, 0.1 points per trillion, and that proves that it's a chemtrail." It's just the most extreme form of ridiculous cherry picking, and should be pointed out as such.
Yeah, it's definitely not convincing to see them in amounts that small. I also think it's interesting to explore the purported motives behind this. There's this guy who's featured on InfoWars quite a bit. I'm not sure if you've heard of this guy. His name is Dr. Edward Group. There's this hilarious interview he does with someone on InfoWars where he's talking about a vacation he went on, and he talks about how he was at some national parks around Utah or something like that. And he's like, "Yeah, I was there, and they were doing some really heavy chemtrail spraying when we were there at a bunch of tourist sites. And then over the next couple of days, I got sick." And he goes on and talks about how it's the chemtrail flu, and they're spraying stuff to intentionally make people sick. And at one point he's like, "Yeah, I could just feel internally that this was a man-made sort of sickness and not something from microorganisms." And I'm like, how can you just tell that based on how it feels to you?
Yeah.
And you just look at the logic behind that, where someone's like, "Well, I looked in the sky and saw chemtrails, and then I got sick. Therefore, the chemtrails caused it." It's the classic logical fallacy, post hoc ergo propter hoc, which translates to after this, therefore because of this. Just because something preceded an event doesn't mean it was the cause of the event. How many times did this guy get sick when there weren't any apparent chemtrails in the sky? How many times were there chemtrails and he didn't get sick? It's just he's just it's just confirmation bias, where he's just he sees what he thinks is the cause, but really it's just pure coincidence.
Yeah, and why didn't everybody else get sick? Because if he's seeing contrails across the sky, that means he's basically in the middle of at least a 50-mile radius area that has contrails around it, which means anybody within 50 miles of him would get pretty much the same exposure to the contrails or the chemtrails or whatever they want to call them as he did. So if he's getting sick because of it, then everybody should be getting sick. You know, if you're over a city like, you know, LA or whatever, and you know, you see contrails and you get sick, it's not just you. It's not. They're not just like focusing these contrails down on you and making you sick. Everybody would be getting exactly the same thing as you. So if there was some kind of sickness being caused by contrails, then you would be seeing an awful lot of it, and not just the people who are a bit suspicious. And yeah, that's kind of what it boils down to. Like, it's people, they feel sick and they look up and they see something and they attribute it to that. It's the suspicious people like to have a reason for their feeling sick, and sometimes I don't think they're even really sick at all. They just it's like people who feel like they have electromagnetic sensitivity. They feel sick when they think they're next to a Wi-Fi router, regardless of whether it's switched on or off, because they feel like they should feel sick because there's this bad thing. So they think, oh, chemtrails, that's a bad thing. I feel sick now. I have it's a psychological thing. I have the same thing myself. You know, it's coronavirus times now, and
Right.
if I go out to the store and then come back, I start feeling sick. I start feeling like, you know, what is this, the coronavirus? I can feel something tickling my throat. Do I have a fever? But it's just because you've been in a situation that you feel like is a bit dangerous, and you start thinking, you know, you start looking at your body, feeling your body, and thinking like, am I sick? I was in this bad situation. I must be feeling sick. It's the naturalist thing in the world to start feeling ill when you start thinking about, am I feeling ill? Like, if you start thinking now, do I have a headache? I just thought of it myself. And now when I think of it, I kind of do have a bit of a headache. Yeah. Is my back aching? It is actually aching a little bit. Yeah. Is my arm itching right here? It is actually starting to itch. So it's like when you start focusing on parts of your body, especially as you get older and you have more aches and pains, then you're going to find something wrong, which you just weren't paying attention to before. And then you discover this little tingle or whatever and attribute it to something nefarious.
You know, it also reminds me of whenever there's a spider in your home or something, and then for the next 10 minutes, every little tingle, you're like, it's a spider. It's crawling up my leg or whatever. It kind of reminds me of that. I don't know. When I look at the logic of something like that, and you really boil it down, it's hard to describe it as anything other than just completely delusional. To be like, well, I got sick, so therefore evil men in airplanes sprayed microorganisms on me. It's just like, it's such an enormous mental leap that just doesn't at all scale with what's happening at the level of the body, where it's just like people get sick. It happens, you know?
I wouldn't describe it as delusional for a lot of people, because they don't really think it through, and they don't really have a fully formed like belief system. They're just kind of loosely attributing it to this bad thing. Like, you know, if they really had this complex and well thought out belief system that they've gone through and then you've been unable to shake them. Like, the definition of being delusional is to have a fixed false belief. And I think it's important to distinguish that from people who simply make mistakes. If you have a mistaken belief, that's not really a delusional belief. It's delusional if it can't be shaken by the facts. But they're just very wrong to start off with. They just think that, you know, contrails are causing their illnesses. But I wouldn't start out saying they're delusional. Start out assuming that they're simply wrong, and then try to dissuade them from it. If they can't, then perhaps there's some delusion going on there. But most people, I think, when they have the facts explained to them over a sufficient amount of time with a sufficient care, they will actually, you know, get out of it.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, this conspiracy brings to mind a similar point that you brought up with 9/11 truthism, the whole controlled demolition idea, where it's like, just imagine how many thousands of people would have to be involved in this. You would have to have, you know, the airplane engineers and the people that work at the FAA and, you know, the biologists who engineer the concoctions for maximum impact, and then the government officials and the people in the media. And you have all these thousands of people working in concert to such horrible, devious ends, where it's like, we want to dumb people down or make them sick, and not one of them is going to blow the whistle on it. It seems very unlikely to me.
No, it's a far more outlandish idea than the 9/11 thing, in terms of, you know, how many people would be needed to cover it up and how many people you have to fool. Like I talked earlier about all the engineering students who should be able to figure out that there was something going on with the the 9/11 building collapses, but they somehow can't figure it out, or they somehow have all been pressured to not talk about it. With the contrail theory, like somehow you've got to convince the entire population of the planet that contrails used to persist when they all have a memory of them not persisting. So you've got to somehow brainwash the entire world into forgetting something. It's not just simply like, fooling a bunch of engineers. You've actually got to change human history. You've got to say, oh, all these textbooks that existed from the 1940s have to be somehow faked, or back then in the 1940s they created these textbooks knowing that in the year 2000 they would be doing this plot to change the weather by spraying. It's a whole level of complication higher, an order of magnitude of more complication than the 9/11 conspiracy theory. So I think getting people to think about what would actually be involved really helps narrow it down. And I think because the chemtrail theory has been around for a while and people have been pointing these things out, pointing out these contrails used to exist, it actually has kind of whittled down the conspiracy theory, the followers of it, to either people who don't know very much about the theory and they're just like, oh yeah, man, yeah, chemtrails are a thing, because they just throw it in with all the other ones, or the people who have a very extreme view of reality and they think everything is faked, and they actually think that the chemtrail thing goes back to the 30s and it started back in the 1930s, and this has been long-running plan by the Illuminati to fool the entire world. It's like flat Earth level of fooling millions and millions of scientists and ordinary people. And the more reasonable conspiracy theorists who actually look at the evidence now have kind of fallen away from the movement, and you're just left with these extremists or the superficial believers and nothing much in between now.
It's also worth considering that if they're spraying this just willy-nilly into the atmosphere, what's stopping the friends, the family members, even the people actively involved in this campaign from breathing it in themselves? Whether it's to get people sick or dumb them down or engage in some sort of mind control, like they breathe the same atmosphere that we do. So it's not like, Bill Gates or whoever is involved in this goes out in public and wears a gas mask everywhere he goes. So how do they avoid, being susceptible and suffering in the same ways?
Well, I guess they've been vaccinated, but then vaccines are evil, so that wouldn't work.
No, these are special vaccines. These are the good vaccines in this case.
Yeah, vaccines for the good people. Yeah, and that argument. I think a lot of people who believe in the chemtrail conspiracy theory now, they don't really think so much about it being for poisoning people. Most of the people who still believe in it think that it's some kind of geoengineering thing, because the biggest site for chemtrails now is geoengineeringwatch.org, right, which is this kind of crazy apocalyptic site where there's a guy who runs it, Dane Wigington, the same guy who did the pond sample, who all he does every week is he releases a video saying, the military-industrial complex madhouse continues with the world's destruction, and the impending apocalypse is upon us if we can wake up and do something about it. And it's been saying basically the same thing for the last 10 plus years, and nothing ever really changes. Every time something happens, like the forest fires in California 2 years ago, or the coronavirus now, or just the weather extremes from climate change, he just attributes that to being part of the grand plan, and the world's going to end. But yeah, he's the guy who's really pushing it, and so because he ties it very closely to the idea of secret geoengineering, most of the people who believe in the chemtrail conspiracy theory, except for the really outlandish people, think that it's some kind of secret engineering, which might also be toxic, but only in the sense that pollution is toxic. So you really shouldn't focus too much on theories about the poisoning aspect of it, because that's not really a big part of the theory, and in some ways it's a bit of a red herring. So yes, geoengineering is what they claim is what's going on.
Yeah, I think it depends on who you listen to, because that InfoWars documentary, or rather the interview I talked about, it was only from a couple years ago. And I'm not saying this guy represents the community or whatever,
Yeah.
but there are people that do believe this. So it's not like I'm
Oh yeah.
straw manning
No,
them by saying that or anything like that.
there are some. There are some, but I think like if you're going to be addressing the broader chemtrail community as such, like
Right.
you got to acknowledge that most of them are geoengineering people. But yeah, there's people who think there's some people who think that it's a way of delivering some kind of microchip nanorobot into your bloodstream so that they can either vaccinate you or control your thoughts. And then they tie it in with other things like HARP and radio waves and 5G. Some people will say that 5G is activating things that were spread by chemtrails. So yeah, there are these more extreme conspiracy theories out there, and yeah, they're worth addressing too. But they're kind of a minority belief, and because they are so extreme, they're kind of unlikely to spread. Like the whole nanochips thing in the bloodstream, I don't think gets very much traction. Who knows? I don't know. People have been burning down 5G cell phone towers. Crazy times we live in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it definitely is important to make sure you're always framing your opponent's position accurately, because one of the quickest ways to turn someone off or alienate them is to make it appear like you're straw manning them. So I think it is a good point that you make there. Yeah, it gets back to that earlier point that we made about truthers, where there's a whole spectrum of belief that they adhere to, and some are on the far end, some are more moderate, some are on the mild ends. And really, I would just kind of close out this conversation by making that general point that I think people who believe in the chemtrails conspiracy theory, they're making that mistake of taking on way more assumptions than you need to actually explain the observations. And I would invite them to reconsider. I'm wondering if you have any other general points you'd like to add about our discussion, or just any points in general.
Well, I guess there's kind of 2 points I would make. One is that just remember the conspiracy theories are mostly good people who think they are doing good work. They think they're trying to save the world. They're not bad people, most of them. Some of the people who are promoting it for money, they're kind of bad people, or they're doing bad things. But most people are acting in good faith based on what they believe to be true. And then the other point is, if you are a conspiracy theorist, if people who are conspiracy theorists, keep an open mind. A lot of people who believe in conspiracy theories think they're being very open-minded because they are very open to these alternative beliefs. But at the same time, they end up only looking at these alternative beliefs, and they don't really balance it against the conventional wisdom of what's actually going on. So to have a genuinely open mind, make sure you're listening to both sides of the argument. Don't just listen to the arguments for the prosecution, listen to the arguments for the defense, and make a decision based on the totality of the evidence and not just the evidence for one side.
Very well said. And I would close by repeating that hilarious quote I always enjoy, where I think it was James Randi who once said, "Keep an open mind, just not so open that your brains fall out." He is Mick West. He is the author of the book Escaping the Rabbit Hole. Where can these people follow you and connect with you?
They can follow me on Twitter at Mick West, which is probably the best place. And my website is metabunk.org. Or if you just search Google for Mick West, then all my stuff will crop up in front of you.
Awesome. Thanks for doing this. We should do it again sometime.
Indeed. Thank you. It's a very interesting conversation.